So that we have that insight that helps us to see the existence of the moral law. But even with that, unless what he refers to as the power, put that in the notes as a capital P, meaning something very powerful like God, unless the power behind the universe reveals itself, mere observations or scientific endeavors will never tell us anything about the power that provided the moral law. We can look in ourselves, and we can see a moral law operating. We can see that it's telling us which instincts or behaviors to encourage or to discourage at any given moment. But we can't figure out the reason or the why behind the power of the moral law without him revealing it to us. So the power that created the universe could not be contained in or by the universe. Okay, and the example here that C.S. Lewis uses is just as a builder or an architect cannot function as a door or the wall of the house he built. Okay, that's not it. He can design the house. He might be able to stand in the doorway or lean up against a wall, but he can't really function as a door or a wall, but he certainly can be the designer of it. So by extension, God is not in the universe as a material function of the universe. He exists outside of the universe like an architect, like a builder who builds a house. And we find that he has put his existence of his moral law into our hearts. Take a drink. So if this power wanted to communicate his existence, again, we're just using the word power, not God yet. The power wanted to communicate his existence to us. He would have to put something inside of us to reveal his presence and his will to us. So this is a postulated conclusion that C.S. Lewis is making here, that if the power wants to communicate to humanity, he would have to put something inside of us that reveals who he is or his purposes for us. And that's what we find when we look inside of us. That's what we see. It's exactly what we find. The presence of a real moral law that could not have come about by human will or human reasoning. So when we examine ourselves personally, we truly find this moral law at work within us, and it truly prompts us in virtually every situation to act in a certain way, or it may convict us when we fail to act in a certain way. So the moral law operating within us is often contrary to our own will and desires, and we've seen that already, where it costs me something to follow the true moral law. And the power behind the moral law seems to be directing the whole universe, and yet it operates inside of each and every human being, urging us to do right and wrong. So we're starting to get a picture of, first off, the one who gave us a true moral law, and we start to see the incredible power and wisdom behind the true moral law when we find out that he's controlling everything in the universe by his mighty hand, but he also has the capacity and the power and the will to put right and wrong directly within every human being. And certainly no scientific explanation can justify our understanding of that. That same power makes us feel uncomfortable and responsible for disregarding these moral standards. This power would seem to be like a mind that has a will with preferences regulating human behavior. Wait a minute, so we're starting to really just put our first toe into the idea of a theistic God, and that he has a nature and a character and a will. He's not just some power, some force that somehow operates and controls the universe. Actually has will and preferences and standards and the power and capacity to communicate those very things into the heart, mind, soul of every human being. So based on all this, it seems absurd to think that matter, like atoms and molecules, could ever have a moral preference that would ever influence human behaviors in the way that the moral law does. So this is a charge against the concept of materialism, where all we are is matter. A big bang explosion happened from somehow, some way in ancient past, and somehow we're just a bunch of accidental chemical arrangements, and we're now just a bag of chemicals. It seems absurd to think that a bag of just random chemicals coming together would ever have any kind of influence over our behaviors, especially those that we really don't want to encourage but feel we should encourage, that they could come from any other source but the power behind the true moral law. Therefore, it seems time to admit, in C.S. Lewis' conclusion about 70 years ago, and also today, that society has chosen the wrong path by rejecting God and rejecting the nature and existence of the true moral law. There seems to be no valid substitute for the moral law that governs our actions and behaviors. Again, this is just a summary of where we have come through. We find this curious notion that all people everywhere know there's a moral standard. And they also recognize that for the most part, most of us choose not to obey that same moral standard. But there is no substitute for God or the power behind them having the capacity to communicate these morals to us. So back to the mathematics examples. Okay. So when a person doing mathematics, and this is just a indictment, if you will, on our culture and our society, especially one that believes in a big bang and evolution and all those kind of things. Okay. When a person, C.S. Lewis says, doing a mathematic, or what he calls sums, realizes that a mistake has been made, the most unreasonable thing to do is to keep going with the false hope of getting the right answer in the end. So in this case, if I were to say 2 plus 2 equals 8, and then I need to do something with that product of that 8 and multiply it by 5 and make 40 or whatever, right? There's no way, if I got the first part of the mathematical equation wrong, that if I continue on, I'm going to get the right answer. It's just never going to happen. So the most unreasonable thing we can do is just keep going, and that's what he's saying about society. The most unreasonable thing we can do is just keep advancing and never recognizing the mistake we've made early on by rejecting God and rejecting the moral law. Okay? Instead, the most reasonable thing we can do is to go back to the start and avoid making that same mistake again, meaning it's time to go back to God, time to go back to a true moral standard, begin to allow that to shape and define our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of how society was intended to function, and then begin to make progress from there. Where we've gone 70 years ago, and certainly where we are today with a very wicked, corrupt, and immoral societies that we live in, we can't keep going that way, or we'll never come back to where we need to be. We've got to start back at the basics. We've got to go back to a society that has faith, hope, and trust in a living God, and a living God who has given us his pure standard for a moral law. There's nothing moral, or nothing progressive, I should say, or noble about refusing to admit when we've made a mistake. Okay? And any attempts to disobey or disregard the moral law is a mistake. So now recognize at this point in both books, actually, Mere Christianity and I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, neither one of them to this point in our study has gotten to the point of declaring that the God of the Bible or the God of Christianity is the actual God. That's racing way too far ahead to say we've landed on the right answer, as we have started from the ground level zero, and so we're not going to accept anything until we prove it to be true. What we've proven all to this point through all of these lines of evidence is that there is a beginning of the universe has design, and there is a moral law that all humanity knows that exists, even if we choose to disobey it. We haven't gotten as far or as fast as talking about the God of the Bible. So that was a point that C.S. Lewis made there in chapter 5. But the information we have about the power, using that pronoun for God instead of God, behind the universe and the moral law. Here's some information just by observation we can get. So, number one, The universe has both incredible design and beauty, but it's also a world that is dangerous. Okay? They seem to be incompatible somewhat. It's beautiful. We can look at plants and trees and oceans and stars and the universe and the inner workings of the cell that's in our bodies. It's beautiful, but it's also dangerous. Therefore, attempting to understand the power by observing the universe is not likely to yield meaningful results because we're kind of looking at evidences that seem to be contradictory or incompatible one with another. God is beautiful. God loves beauty. But does then God also like dangerous and harmful and wickedness? Well, no, because we have the moral law that tells us he doesn't like things like wickedness and evil and immorality. So we're not going to find out much about the power by just looking at the universe per se. We can find out some things, but our ability to distinguish fact from fiction or truth from error is challenging because of the fact that we live in this world where there's certain things that don't fully line up with a consistent understanding of the power. But what we do have is the moral law. We recognize here at this stage in our study that the moral law is undeniable. Efforts to understand it, the moral law, may tell us much more about the power than attempts to discover who the power is or what he likes by looking at the universe in its both beautiful and flawed state that we find ourselves in. All right, moving on here. This is in your notes, letter H, on chapter 5, point number 9. The power appears to be appears to be intensely interested in right conduct, fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith actions, and truthfulness among all human beings. That should tell us something. It seems like if he wants that for us, that the power, God, also is interested in or always acts in accordance with right conduct, fair play, unselfishness, courage, good faith, and truthfulness. Okay. So because of the moral law we find in ourselves, we ought to be able to conclude this power itself is good and that it genuinely prefers good conduct compared to evil conduct. That tells us something. So when we see evil conduct, when we see something dangerous or harmful in the universe that we live in, it should tell us that maybe, at a very minimum, the power, God, doesn't prefer those things, but he's allowing them at a minimum to happen. But when we see the moral law in us, operating and challenging us to be the right person, doing the right things at the right time, because he is that sheet of music that's telling us how we're to act, well, we can conclude that the power behind the moral law prefers good conduct over evil. We should define that good in this sense is not to be misunderstood as indulgent or weak on moral offenses. God is good because he lets me get away with it, whatever I want to get away with. I really like that. That's good. No, that's not what good is. Good is preferring goodness to evil. Okay? The moral law in this power has given us, the moral law that he's given to us is hard as nails, right? It has no variability or flexibility when it comes to our observing of the true moral standard. It's hard as nails. It tells you stop doing that immoral action. It tells you to engage in true moral actions that we're called to. It doesn't care, it doesn't ask us for opinions, doesn't care how we feel about it. It just tells us the truth. And that shows us something about the character of who God is, at least in comparison to the moral law. So one part of us as human beings really agrees with God that he has set standards, and the standards that he has set are correct. So most of humanity, I think we can conclude, are naturally opposed to acts of greed and trickery being committed against us. I don't know anybody who likes being tricked and is harmed by that trickiness and being deceit. having deceit engaged against us, or being, engaged in someone being greedy against us. You find out that, again, you bought a car and you find out that that you could have bought that same car for $6,000 less than you paid, and you feel the only reason why you got ripped off is because of the person's greed who didn't tell you the fair market value of that car. We don't like that. We agree with God. We agree with the power that it would be immoral to be greedy in our business conduct or financial transactions. We're also naturally opposed to being exploited by another person. I mean, I'm sure there's nobody out there who wants to be exploited. It's not a positive term. It's not something we ever want to be described as of who we are or what we're doing. We're naturally opposed to being exploited by someone else, whether it's through slavery or whether it's through an employer or whether it's through some other form of manipulation. We don't like to be exploited by other people. So we agree with God that exploitation would be immoral. We're naturally against being victims of acts of murder and rape and violence and child abuse. We're just naturally against that. We just don't find in society very many people who find any one of these things to be morally acceptable. Violence, murder, rape, child abuse, certainly not against them. This is not to say that these things don't happen. People obviously engage in violence, murder, rape, child abuse all the time. But as we often find, what they don't want is any of these things committed against them or someone they love and care about and don't want those things happening to them. So even a violent gang member doesn't really want violence committed against himself in the same way he might be violent towards someone else. So with that, we also find that in ourselves is an innate desire for the power, God, to make an exception in our own case, to let us off just this time, though we may be far less willing if we're the victim to be let off. We want justice. When somebody has harmed us or someone we love, stolen from us, most of us are champions of justice. When we're on the other end of that, we've done something that harms somebody else, we can't wait for justice to be set aside so we can receive mercy. But we typically always want to make excuses for our bad behavior, our standards not measuring up to the moral law, but we often hold other people to a standard that we do not or would like not to have ourselves held to that same standard. So, if the power is objectively good and always prefers to have the moral law observed by human beings, then we might properly conclude that this power hates almost everything that we as human beings do. We should often, take a moment to let that sink in. If the power is objectively good and prefers the moral law be observed, then the right conclusion is he probably also hates most everything human beings do. And I should throw in a theological caveat to that and say that does not say that God hates us or hates human beings, but I think it's a correct conclusion to say he hates many of the things that we do and everything that we do when it violates his moral standards. So that puts that concept of God preferring good and hating immorality, but us engaging all too often in immoral behavior, puts all of humanity in a terrible fix. If the universe is not governed by a power defined by absolute goodness, then all of our efforts to survive in this universe that we live in are hopeless. Okay? Total suppression of the moral law, however, would collapse society. Can you imagine if every human being abandoned every tenet of a moral code that exists within us? Total, rampant, absolute anarchy everywhere and every place we go. You couldn't trust anybody in a business deal. You could not be trusted to walk down a street and not be murdered or raped or robbed in some way. Okay? It would be total anarchy, total chaos. Society would collapse if we completely suppressed or abandon the moral law. Okay? So we have God who's given us this absolute goodness and his moral standard, and we need to observe that it really is right and it really is beneficial to society to as best as possible to observe that same moral standard that he's given us. If the moral power behind the law does exist, right? This is the opposite. If he does exist, then we are clearly making ourselves his enemies every day by our disobedience to the moral law. This also seems like it's a hopeless situation. So if we abandon God and abandon a moral law, we can only expect complete anarchy, total collapse of society, and really just virtually almost a certain death of humanity in a very short period of time if we abandon God and abandon all moral standards. However, if we retain the existence of God in our thinking and our hearts and our acknowledgement of truth, okay, and we acknowledge that he exists and that he is a God who upholds and demands righteous behavior of all humanity, then we also recognize that this is hopeless because we've now made ourselves enemies of the very God that gave us the ability to exist as a society in the first place. Okay? So it seems hopeless without understanding how we can, it seems hopeless if we don't understand how we can get along in a world where we can't abandon God, but when we accept God, we become his enemies. We need to figure out how we can be made right with him without abandoning him. That's the main crux of the issue here when it comes to the moral law. He has given it to us. He demands that we follow it. He must hate most everything we do, and therefore we have become his enemies because we don't obey his law. Well, there's got to be a solution because either one of these choices seems to be untenable. And this one is completely untenable, meaning abandoning God and abandoning a moral standard is untenable. Accepting God and recognizing we're his enemies is not untenable if he's given us a solution for our moral failings and our inability to maintain proper relationship with him. And fortunately, we know in Christianity that he has. Simply put, taking these two things, we cannot live without the moral law, and we also cannot live under it. Okay, when we understand the absolute hard as nails category that we find ourselves in, when we see that, we should be supremely terrified when we understand the power unquestionably disapproves of our conduct. So, goodness, this is a quote directly from C.S. Lewis here. Goodness is either the great safety, that goodness of that power behind the moral law is either the great safety or the great danger, according to the way that you or I react to it. And we find in society and humanity at large, we have reacted the wrong way. It is from this basic understanding of the moral law that Christianity begins to offer the answers to this great moral dilemma. So we haven't proven Christianity yet, but because this is such a challenging doctrine to integrate into our thinking, that we have to have a moral law, because if we abandon it, society collapses. But if we have a moral law, then we're God's enemies. It's important to point out right here that Christianity actually has some answers for those seeking to be right with God and without abandoning the moral law. So Christianity, promotes repentance and offers us the promise of forgiveness. That's encouraging. That's hopefulness rather than hopelessness when we look at this moral law dilemma that we have. Once we acknowledge that we have gone against the moral law, even just once, we understand that we are now enemies of the moral law giver. So that's important, that we acknowledge that we're enemies of the moral law giver. That's a major step in becoming someone who is rightly forgiven for our deeds of immorality and our transgressions against a perfect and holy and righteous God. But thankfully, he has offered mankind a means of forgiveness for all of our transgressions. And so, again, by comparison, it's only when we're sick, only when we recognize that we're a moral transgressor, that we need the advice of a doctor when we're sick or of the Christian solution when we realize that we're a sinner. Those who do not know they are sick are not very likely to accept painful or costly treatment thinking they're healthy. Why would I take anything that harms me or hurts me or changes my financial situation? But if you actually know and accept the fact that you're sick, most of us will accept some level of medical treatment. In the same way, once we acknowledge that we are sinners and have made ourselves enemies of God, we are probably far more likely to accept his solution to the problem that he offers to us rather than trying to go at it in our same old way that we have. Therefore, acknowledging that we have become God's enemies by our immoral conduct is really the first step in being made right with him. The solution of the Christian doctrine is this. Okay? God himself, so this is Christianity in summary, again, without proving God yet or proving Christianity is true yet. God himself became a man to save men from their transgressions against the moral law, all of mankind. This God-man, Jesus Christ, both God and man, met the demands of the moral law on our behalf. So in the long run, Christianity offers unspeakable comfort, but it begins to truly understand the inescapable predicament that man finds ourselves in. Okay, so Christianity offers unspeakable comfort because we're enemies of God, but Christ tore down the separation between God and man by offering himself as payment for our sins. Okay? But we have to acknowledge that we're in this predicament, or we probably are very unlikely to accept the payment that he's made for us. If we try to seek comfort without truth in this world, we will gain neither comfort or truth in the end. Wishful thinking does not result in comfort or in the avoidance of the consequences for avoiding the moral law. We need to seek something other than just pure comfort in our understanding of our predicament of being in a moral law failing as we go. So if you're looking at your notes, that concludes Book 1 of Mere Christianity, what he calls Book 1 or Section 1, you might prefer to call it. So for now, I'm going to keep going into Book 2, and this is jumps into Book 2, and it goes into Chapter 2 of Book 2 as we look here. So I'm just, for your notes, so you might have a different set of notes that have been emailed to you or whatever, you pulled down from the website. This is the second set, so this is, this is going to be called Section 5.3, and it's Part 1. We'll finish this actually on my timeline tomorrow night when we go back to live streaming from the Tuesday night class. But I want to get the live stream up to the same place we were with those who attended class last week, or actually 2 weeks ago. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get this in the right mode and go. So, Mere Christianity, Book 2. Rival conceptions of God. So here's where we will, both with Mere Christianity to start, and we'll then go back to I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. We're going to start looking at the competing claims about which God, if you will, or religious system is the right one to follow, which one most closely matches with reality and can be proven beyond the reasonable doubt threshold, so we follow the right solution to our problems and we follow the right God of that system rather than a false God or something that won't lead us to forgiveness for our transgressions and sins against God. Okay. All right, point number 1, or letter A in your notes. Other than pure atheism, meaning there is truly no God, is atheism, Christians do not have to believe that all other theistic faiths are entirely incorrect. This is a claim from C.S. Lewis here. Okay, So he's making the statement that we might find nuggets of truth, even truth about God or creation or salvation, in more than just one system. And if we do that, we should recognize that where there's consistency between this religious view and that religious view or whatever, that both views may be correct. They may not be, but they might be correct if there's some consistency between two or more competing views. But it's only in the inconsistencies where we see a difference between Christianity and the other theistic beliefs. And this seems to be common sense here. When we begin to understand how Christianity answers these problems of our sin problem and our being enemies of a holy and righteous God, we need to recognize that where it makes claims that are different from any other religious system, we need to evaluate how those claims, whether they answer the question about the rightness and correctness of God and our relationship to Him through faith or through salvation, and where they're not. So we're trying to look at differences, not consistencies between religious systems here. It is only in the inconsistencies where we see these differences. So that's what we need to evaluate. So by definition, being a Christian means believing that our views are correct. So if you're a Christian, being a Christian by definition is believing that what you believe about God is the correct view, and where anything else competes or contradicts our understanding of Christianity or of God, that they must be wrong, because otherwise you wouldn't be a Christian. So if you're a Christian, you're believing that these other religious systems and making claims about getting right with God must be false if Christianity is true. We cannot have two contradictory or competing truth claims both be true at the same time and in the same sense. That goes back to our logic discussions that we've had earlier on in this series of studies. Okay? So only one can be true. If you're a Christian, we believe that the Christian view is the correct one and all others must be false. As a theistic religion, Christianity is the major, is in the majority, I should say, of historical beliefs, okay, that reject atheism, which would include materialism, including things like the belief systems of the ancient Greeks and the Romans and the Stoics, the Platonists, the Hindus, the Muslims, and many others. Okay? So we're consistent. The point he's making here is that Christianity lines up with the majority of historical beliefs about God, and atheism, pure atheism or pure materialism, that all things are just material, is in the minority. So here it's nice that we're in the majority viewpoint, because atheism is definitely not in the majority. It never has been, and it still is not in the majority today. Most people believe in some theistic understanding of our existence and our relationship to eternity. So when we look at this, some major views, now you can study world religions and get all kinds of different views and definitions of things, but this is just a quick summary to get us to where we're going. Lewis talks about, major views are things that are not atheistic and materialistic. Things like pantheism. Pantheism would we define as God is beyond good and evil. Everything is part of God, and this God, lowercase g here, is part of everything. So I'm God, you're God, the chair's God, the ceiling's God, everything is God, and everything is part of one another through that. That's pantheism. Okay? It's illogical, and it certainly is not supported by the evidence. Then, second major religious view is monotheism. Mono meaning one, theism meaning God, one God viewpoint. There's one God, and this God exists separate from his creation. Much like we talked about with the builder and the architect cannot be their house, God exists apart from, stands above and beyond, and exists entirely before the creation that brought everything else that we know and experience into this world to bear. So in that viewpoint of true monotheism, there's really three main worldviews, and that is Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So we will look at those because those are consistent with what we see about a moral lawgiver, and going back to what we've already learned in I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. It's also consistent with the cosmological line of reasoning. God is the creator, and the teleological line of reasoning. God is the designer of all things. So Judaism, Islam, and Christianity seem to meet the definitions that we see here. Christianity opposes pantheism because we observe that many things in the universe have gone very wrong. To say that murder is God and murderers are just as much God as somebody who doesn't commit murder, and all of the things that are just wrong, cancer and disease, and we recognize this universe is winding down to an ultimate heat death. All of these things that seem to have gone very wrong in the universe, okay, can't be God, because we already have established that God is good, and those kinds of things, whether actions by human beings or the fact that we are living in a world that is riddled with problems, genetic diseases and other diseases and forms that are happening in the world, that doesn't seem to reflect the moral lawgiver who is inherently good. But we also recognize that good and bad are real, and they have meaningful distinctions between them in the world that we live in. We've already declared things like rape and child abuse and murder and theft and lying and a multitude of other things are inherently, by nature, wrong. By this moral law, they're wrong. And so if they're wrong, then they can't be a reflection of who God is, as a pantheist would claim. Okay. The question that must be answered by theists, that would be those of us who believe in God, and generally speaking, monotheists, a one true God, is this: if God is good and he made the world, why has this world actually gone so very wrong? Why do we see sickness and cancer and disease and murder and strife and all of the kinds of things that we've been talking about? If God is good and he's the creator of the world, why has it gone so very wrong? I find when you're dealing with people who are unbelievers, this is a big question for them. If you like theological terms, we would put this into the category of theodicy. Okay, Theodcy, I think it is, CIY. Never can spell orally. But theodicy is the theological term, and it describes, the condition of a world that's fallen as compared to a God who is good. And so it begins to help us understand the character and nature of that. But fortunately, and we won't get into it in this study, and it'll take a little bit longer to get into it, we do see those answers about why is it that we have a good God who did create all that we see and is intensely concerned about right and wrong in the universe we live in. Why is there evil in the world? Or as a phrase that a lot of people like to use, why do good things happen or bad things happen to good people? First off, there's assuming that anybody is good, which Jesus tells us there's not. But it does recognize that some people experience things they know are wicked, they know are wrong, and they want to blame God for it. So Christianity tells us we should be blaming man for it and acknowledging that God has given us a pathway back into rightness with him and back into his perfect plan for goodness at the end of the age. So this was as an atheist for C.S. Lewis. If you don't know, C.S. Lewis was an atheist for much of his early life, just like I was an atheist for much of my early life. And when C.S. Lewis was an atheist, he tells us that he objected to God because the universe seemed so very cruel and unjust. But you understand, this is where he began his understanding of who God actually is. Because, he said, okay, I'm an atheist, and I find that I can't believe in God because the world seems very cruel and very unjust in my observation. But that's what actually led him into Christianity. Because he began to ask questions like, where did the idea of just and unjust come from? How did he know anything was unjust? We can identify, let's say, a crooked line only because we understand what a straight line should look like. If we've never seen a straight line, we would have no concept of that a line was crooked or off in some way. We need a standard by which to judge. And as a philosopher, Lewis began to understand, I'm calling the world that I live in cruel and unjust, but that must mean there really is a standard of justice and goodness that I'm comparing the world I live in to, and I see that it's not conforming to that standard. It's a very intellectually satisfying understanding here. He understood that we can't have an concept or understanding of justice and goodness by, let me put it another way. Can't understand what would be cruel or unjust behavior or conditions of the world that we live in if we didn't know that a standard that was not those things actually existed. If everything was bad in the universe that we live in, everything was chaotic, it was disorganized, it was a result of a cosmic explosion like the Big Bang, then how would any human being ever have a sense of what was either good or bad in some way? We just wouldn't. Okay? He uses this example. Man feels wet when we're in water, swimming pool or an ocean or whatever. Fish, who are never out of the water, don't feel wet, they just feel that they are. Okay? So, like C.S. Lewis would say, I wouldn't know what cruelty is unless I know there's some standard. Like a fish doesn't know what wet is unless it had some sense of not being wet. And fish, generally speaking, are always wet in the environment they were designed to exist in. So in C.S. Lewis's very act of trying to disprove God, because of the cruelty and the wickedness and the corruption that he witnessed personally, he was then forced to assume that his idea of justice and goodness must have come from a source outside of the corrupted universe that he lived in. That's really insightful. Again, really powerful. To recognize I'm trying to prove God doesn't exist because of the evil things that I see in the world. But in trying to prove the evil things I see in the world, instead of disproving God, I prove that God must exist and that he must have had a standard given to the world of right behavior, right conduct, goodness, and perfection that I can only know about if he told me about them. It's really profound. So if the whole universe had no meaning, it would seem to have been impossible for any human being to discover that the universe had no meaning or no purpose. As if light did not exist, then no human being or no animal even could even begin to understand what darkness is. Darkness would be a word without meaning unless light actually exists. I hope you see the parallel there. If we live in a world of darkness and evil, we wouldn't call it darkness or evil or wicked or anything unless we had a sense of what something opposite was. Okay. And so we begin to see the need and necessity of God's existence in the fact that any one of us should easily be able to identify the world we live in is messed up. It's cruel, it's wicked, it's evil, it's got all kinds of things going wrong in it. And we see that with all kinds of protests. We see it with all kinds of tearing down of history and things that we see even happening in our world today. Because the people who are doing some of these actions believe there's injustice. But where would they get the sense of just or injustice if justice itself didn't exist? And if it didn't, where did it come from in a world where there's nothing but injustice in the things we see and do? Therefore, the conclusion for Lewis here is that atheism, there is no God, is just too simple of a philosophical viewpoint and must be rejected since we as humans do not see a world out of order, or we do see a world, out of order, but we also have this sense of what order it ought to be in. Okay. So, Christianity is not simple. This is in chapter 2, the invasion, he calls it, of book 2, chapter 2 in Mere Christianity. Christianity is not simple. And we're not making any apologies for the fact that Christianity is not simple. A watered-down version that attempts to take the good and leave out the challenging aspects of Christian faith simply will not work. Meaning, we don't want to water down Christianity. We want to take it as it is. Too many people and too many religious viewpoints try to water down Christianity, try to make it something that it actually isn't, so that they can simplify it for their own minds or their own systems. But as we can observe in our own lives, and C.S. Lewis postulates for us here, real things are not simple. Fantasies can be simple, but very little we find in real life is actually simple when we understand all that goes into something that's actually real. So here I'm standing behind this pulpit, this wooden pulpit, and it may look simple. It may have taken a very skilled craftsman, an hour, 3 hours or something pretty straightforward to build this thing. I don't know how long it took him. I didn't do it. But it looks fairly simple. But when you actually begin to understand it's made of wood, and wood is made up of a once living tree that had cells in it, and those cells are made up of, well, first off, it had DNA in it, and it had, or at a minimum, had atomic particles in it. When we begin to look at the atom and the subatomic particles that make up an atom are incredibly complex. Incredibly complex. When we actually begin to explore what is in this podium or what is in this pulpit that I'm standing behind. And then even further, for me to look at it or any one of us to see this thing with our eyeballs, the act of seeing it is incredibly complex. So how in the world is it simple to see something, have it enter into our eyes, go into our retinas, go into our cones and rods, begin to translate that image into our brains so that our brains can process it and understand it? That is anything but simple. Like seeing a table is not simple. It can be described in simplistic terms, but the more we unpack it, the more we see reality in its real working form, we understand real things are not simple. And by same analogy, Christianity is not simple. Okay. So another analogy used here is a child's prayer. Might seem simple, but when we analyze what's going on, a child in his heart is beginning to communicate with an infinite and all-powerful God. That's not simple either. Christianity and real things are just not as simple as people would like to make them to be. So we might want to demand simplicity in our religion, like Christianity, but demanding simple will not lead us to any meaningful understanding of truth. Okay. And so C.S. Lewis offers that many skeptics that came across his teachings would complain that Christianity is just too complicated. And and they would even assert that if God were to make a religion, that he would make it simple because they want it to be simple. Well, no. God makes, we don't even really think that God made religion. He just is. God is, and we worship him in spirit and in truth. But real things are not simple, and to talk about God and talk about mankind's fallen nature and our sinfulness and our transgression against the moral law and God's willingness to bring us back into relationship with him even though we were made enemies of him by our own efforts and our own failures, we're not talking about something that's simple. We're talking about something that requires real thought, real attention, because it's actually true. So Christians should be on guard against any kind of attack of somebody wanting just a simple religion, because God has given us the unalterable facts about himself and our relationship to him. And if this definition is not simple, then so be it. Christianity is not simple because that we have a God who is certainly not simple in his own character and nature. So reality is often, in addition to being complex, it's often odd, meaning it's not what we would have expected. In many things we observe, we find oddities that go against what we might have expected, as such as, planets in the solar system. We might, before we got, good telescopes or optics to look deeper into our solar system or deeper into our universe that we, even our own galaxy to explore, we might have thought that all stars were the same size or all planets were the same size and they all spun in the same direction and they all had the same basic characteristics. That would be simple. When we just look at our own planets and our own solar system, we find anything but simplicity. We find very complex inner workings of these planets, and none of them conform to some kind of known standard. They just are. Real things are not simple. C.S. Lewis talks about sexual reproduction. It's not simple. The act of sexual reproduction does not normally meet a child's expectation of the question, Mommy, Daddy, where did babies come from? Even if you tell them, a lot of times they think, no, that can't be. That's not what I was expecting, therefore I reject your answer. Same thing is true in the exploration of Christianity. It's not simple, so we shouldn't be demanding or expecting a simple response to what is Christian faith and why should I follow it. What we observe is that reality is often not what we would have expected. Christianity is not what anyone would have guessed or made up. It has the real kinds of twists and unexpected doctrinal claims that real things have that are not invented by man, not made up. They just are because that's what God created for us. So C.S. Lewis says, simplicities are boys' philosophies that must be left behind. We're not going to engage in simple boys' philosophies. We're actually on a quest to discover what truth is and how that truth responds to the reality that we live in. So the reality that we observe is a universe that is obviously bad in our observation of how it's gone wrong, but it also, within the universe, we have creatures that know that it's bad, that we know that it's gone wrong, and we know that the universe is not fully conforming to our inner sense of true goodness. That ought to tell us that we're on the right path of looking for God's purpose and plan in us. And so for this live stream, that brings us right back up to speed where we'll pick up on Tuesday night, the 7th of March here, I think it is. So I will conclude with that, and we'll shut down the live stream. Hope this is of value to those who missed it the first time around. My apologies for not getting the technical functions working properly the first time, but I'm going to close it down now, and we'll see you next time. Lord bless.